Welcome back to Friday Night Frights on the Mad Hatter Show, where we dive into the world of the paranormal. And tonight we are going to be venturing into one of the more chilling phenomena in modern folklore, the terrifying encounters of the black-eyed kids, or BEKs, as they're sometimes called. These children, with eyes as dark as voids of night, have haunted the nightmares of many who have crossed paths with them for years. The question is, what happens after the encounter? Tonight, we're going to be sharing more horrifying stories of people who've come face to face with these shadowy figures only to experience something far worse than just fear. These stories will leave you wondering what happens when the black-eyed kids don't just haunt your mind, but also your very body. But first, if you haven't already done so, how about hitting that subscribe button? Or one of these black-eyed kids might just show up at your door looking for a new recruit. And they won't leave you until they try to convince you to join an Amway meeting. And trust me, folks, you don't want to do that. So, do yourself a favor, click the like button, and subscribe before they make their pitch. It was a quiet evening when a man, let's just call him Eric, was sitting in his car, parked on the outskirts of town. He hadn't noticed that there was a child approaching. That is, until she knocked on his window. Eric rolled it down just a little, enough to hear the girl's raspy voice. "Can you give me a ride?" she asked, her eyes staring straight ahead, deep black voids that seemed to swallow all light. Eric froze. Something about her seemed wrong, but it wasn't until she repeated the request, this time with a slight tremble in her voice, that Eric's instincts screamed at him to drive away. "I'm sorry, I can't," he said, quickly rolling the window back up. The girl stood there for a moment, her black eyes never leaving his, and then, without a word, she just turned and walked away. Eric couldn't shake the feeling of unease as he watched her disappear into the distance. But when he started his car to leave, something odd happened. The engine sputtered, the lights flickered, and before he could drive off, an overwhelming wave of fatigue had hit him. He felt drained, like all of his energy had been sucked out of him. That night, he couldn't sleep. His body felt like it had been beaten into exhaustion, and his mind raced with thoughts of that girl. But it didn't end there. For weeks after that encounter, Eric felt a constant sense of tiredness, a heaviness that wouldn't lift. No matter how much he rested, he couldn't shake it. And then came the headaches, sharp, pulsating, blinding migraines that kept him awake at night. No matter what he tried, the feeling of being physically drained never went away. Eric was never the same after that night. It was as though something had marked him. Sarah's story begins on a quiet evening in her suburban home. She was settling in for the night, having just finished dinner with her family, when a knock came at her door. She wasn't expecting anyone. Standing on the porch was a boy, no older than 10, with pale skin and unsettling black eyes. "Please, let me in," he said, his voice. "I need to use your phone." Something in his tone sent a cold shiver down Sarah's spine. But she stood there, staring at the child, frozen, unable to move or speak. The boy's gaze intensified, as though willing her to open the door. "No," Sarah finally said, finding her voice. The words felt heavy and forced, but she said, "You can't come in." And yet, she couldn't close the door. There was a strange pull, an invisible force that made her hesitate. It was as if she didn't open the door, something might happen. After a long, excruciating moment, the boy slowly backed away, his black eyes never leaving hers. Sarah slammed the door shut, heart pounding, and locked it as she leaned against it, her mind racing. The encounter felt like a bad dream, something surreal and impossible. But then her phone rang. It was an unknown number. Hesitant, she picked it up. "Let me in, Sarah," the voice on the other end whispered. It was the boy, but how? How could he be calling her? Suddenly, a wave of nausea hit her. Her stomach turned, her hands shaking as she dropped the phone and stumbled to the bathroom. She couldn't explain it. The sense of dread filled her chest like a vice, squeezing all of the air from her lungs. The next few days were a blur. Sarah couldn't eat without feeling sick. She couldn't sleep without waking up drenched in sweat. The image of those black eyes seared into her mind. It was as though the boy had cursed her. No matter where she went, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching her, following her. And every time she looked in the mirror, she could swear, just for a moment, she saw his reflection standing right behind her. The next story comes from a woman named Lisa. One afternoon, while running errands, she parked her car near a small store in the middle of nowhere. She didn't notice the child at first, standing at the edge of the parking lot, just staring at her. It wasn't until she got back to her car that she really saw him. He was standing at the back of her vehicle this time, not moving, just watching her with those dark eyes. Lisa froze, unsure of what to do, but the child simply walked up to the car, knocked slightly on the window, and said, "I'm cold. Can I come inside?" Her heart raced. Something was wrong with this child. He was too calm, too still. Her instinct screamed at her to drive away, to leave. But instead, she opened the door just a crack. "I'm sorry, I can't help you," she said. But as she spoke, a wave of dizziness washed over her. It felt like the air around her had thickened, as though something were pressing down on her chest. The boy didn't respond. He just stood there, his eyes locked on hers, and then suddenly, without a sound, he vanished. Lisa quickly closed the door and locked it. But as she turned on the engine, she felt something wasn't right. Her vision blurred. Her heart raced, and she found herself struggling to breathe. She thought she may even pass out. She barely made it home that day, and for days afterwards, she experienced what she could only describe as a mysterious illness, consisting of nausea, dizziness, and a constant feeling that something was inside of her, draining her vitality. She couldn't explain it. Doctors found nothing physically wrong, but she knew it was somehow connected to the boy with the black eyes. In a small town, a woman named Clara experienced something she would never forget. She was standing outside her house one evening when a boy, barely 8 years old, approached her. "Please, let me in," he said, his voice distant and hollow. Clara, despite feeling the cold dread that settled over her, refused. But then the boy made a gesture toward her home, and she felt an overwhelming sense of fear. It was as if she could hear something, an unnatural silence in the air that cut off all the sounds of the evening around her. That next night, Clara began hearing strange knocks on her door. Every time she checked, no one was there, but the sense of being watched only grew stronger. It wasn't long before she began to experience symptoms of something wrong. Her skin felt cold, her bones ached, and she developed a high fever that wouldn't go away. Every night, the knock would return, and each morning she felt worse than the night before. One night, as she lay in bed, she heard that boy's voice again, coming from the corner of her room. She didn't dare look. A man named Jason tells us about the curse that seemed to follow him long after his encounter with the black-eyed kid. Jason had been driving late at night and stopped briefly to rest when a boy suddenly appeared at his side window. "Can you give me a ride?" the boy asked, his voice distant, like the wind itself. Jason refused, feeling a deep unease. But after that moment, he began to notice strange things happening. His phone would randomly freeze. His car's electrical system began malfunctioning. But worse, Jason himself began to feel ill. So ill that he could barely function. He sought medical attention, but the doctors found nothing wrong, just exhaustion and just maybe some sickness. Yet Jason knew it was tied somehow to that boy. A curse, something dark had followed him from that encounter, and his life was never the same. In the barren, haunting quiet of the southwestern desert, where the land stretches on in a desolate expanse, there are no street lights to pierce the darkness, just the whispering wind and the sound of your own heartbeat. It was one such night that John found himself navigating a lonely stretch of road. The moon hung low, casting a faint glow over the cracked asphalt. He had been driving for hours, his eyes heavy, the road seemingly endless in the dead of night. But as he rounded a corner, something caught his eye. A small figure standing along the side of the highway. At first, John thought it might have been a trick of the light, or maybe some lost traveler in need of help. But as he drew closer, the figure became clearer. A young boy, perhaps 10 years old, standing there in the middle of nowhere, his hands buried deep in his pockets. John slowed his car, uneasy. He considered passing the boy by, but the child suddenly raised a hand, flagging him down. The boy's posture, though, was strange, almost stiff, as though he was waiting for something, waiting for someone. Something in John's gut twisted. A cold feeling spread through him. Why would a child be out here in the middle of the night? The air seemed to grow thick around him, heavy with a sense of impending danger. As he rolled down the window, the boy's voice came in a soft, almost emotionless whisper. "Can you help me?" The words were simple, but they carried an edge of something dark, something unnatural. The boy explained that he had been separated from his parents and needed a ride. His eyes, those eyes, were the first thing that John noticed. Completely black, no whites, no pupils, just an empty void staring back at him. It was as though those eyes were staring straight into his soul, seeing something he didn't want them to see. "Where are your parents?" John asked. The boy didn't seem to answer immediately. Instead, he only blinked once, slowly, as if considering the next words. They're just up ahead. Can you take me to them?" But the air felt thick with dread, and the more John stared at this boy, the more the sense of unease grew, like he was caught in some kind of trap. It was the boy's eyes, of course, the black, hollow eyes that made John feel as though he was losing his grip on reality. They seemed to pull him in, sucking the warmth from his body, like something not quite human was standing there, pretending to be a child. Without thinking, John pressed his foot on the gas pedal, but before he could fully speed off, he felt the boy's gaze burning into him, an invisible weight pressing down on his chest. It was like the boy had reached into his very soul and was gripping it, squeezing it, forcing him to stay. The moment John pulled away, he felt a wave of dizziness sweep over him, a sudden nausea, like the world itself was spinning around him. He had to pull over again just a few miles down the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel as he fought to regain control of himself. What had just happened? For hours afterwards, John felt distant, as though something inside of him had shifted. He had never been one to believe in curses or paranormal forces, but that night something changed. When he finally made it home, the dizziness wouldn't stop. He felt drained, exhausted beyond reason, like all the energy had been sucked from his body. The headache that followed was a constant throb, like a hammer beating against his skull. But it didn't end there. In the days that followed, John's life began to unravel. First, his relationships with family and friends became strained. His job performance suffered. He couldn't focus. His mind seemed clouded, as though it was gnawing at his thoughts like something was stealing his clarity. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, even in his own home. No matter where he went, the sense of presence, the boy's eyes, stayed with him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw them, those black, unblinking eyes staring at him from the darkness. And then it got worse. His body grew weaker. He developed a persistent fever that wouldn't break, no matter what he tried. He felt tired, always tired. No matter how much sleep he got, his body ached as though he had been ill for months, and his health began to decline so quickly that he couldn't even begin to explain it. Something was wrong. Something deep inside gnawing at him. That encounter with that boy had taken its toll. John felt as though he were fading. His vitality was slipping away like a slow burn. The headaches never ceased. His mind, once sharp, now felt fogged, as if a heavy mist had settled over it. Every passing day only seemed to deepen the feeling that he was slowly dying, or at least fading into some kind of limbo. He began to wonder if he had been cursed. Who was that boy? What was it about those eyes, those black, soulless eyes, that had seemed to pierce straight through him? He knew he had made a mistake by stopping, but now it was too late. The boy had left his mark. For weeks he felt the weight, the curse, the darkness, the oppressive feeling that he was always being watched, never truly alone. His health continued to deteriorate, and his personal life crumbled. Relationships faltered, his work faltered. He couldn't escape the grip of the lingering dread. John would never be the same again. That encounter, that brief moment of contact with the black-eyed kid, had changed him forever. The boy had taken something, and no matter what John did, he couldn't get it back. To this day, John wonders if he was simply unlucky to have crossed paths with a child in the desert, or if the boy was something much darker, a shadow, perhaps, from a place far beyond our ordinary world. The black-eyed kids are not simply a ghost story, nor urban legend. They are real, and their encounters have a way of leaving a lasting, unexplainable mark on those that cross their path. A curse, a darkness that lingers long after the child is gone. And in the vast empty desert, where the wind whispers through the sand, the boy still waits. The rain fell in sheets that night, a constant downpour that drummed relentlessly against the windows. The wind howled through the trees, pushing the storm deeper into the small, quiet town. Tina, a businesswoman on a solo trip, had just driven through miles of desolate countryside to reach her destination, an old hotel on the outskirts of town. The moment she pulled into the parking lot, the power went out, casting the hotel into an eerie, unnatural darkness. She checked in at the front desk, her wet shoes clicking on the old creaky floorboards. The clerk, an older man with tired eyes, barely glanced up as he handed her her room key. Tina didn't think much of it at first. She was tired, after all, and eager to rest after a long drive. But as she turned toward the hallway, she froze. There, standing near the corner, was a boy, about 9 or 10 years old, watching her with eyes that seemed to pull at her very soul. His eyes, deep, pitch black, not a hint of white, held her gaze, and in that moment, Tina felt something she couldn't explain. It was as though his eyes weren't just looking at her, but seeing into her, unraveling something deep inside. She could feel a chill run down her spine as she tried to tear her eyes away, but it was almost like her body didn't obey. His stare was hypnotic, cold and unmoving. The boy didn't speak. He just stood there, still and silent, watching her with that unblinking, unsettling gaze. His parents were nowhere to be found. No one else seemed to even notice him. The room felt suddenly quiet, too still, and a sense of dread began to settle over Tina's chest, weighing her down like an invisible force. Despite the unease creeping up her spine, she managed to force herself to look away and walk down the hall towards her room. As Tina entered the room, the eerie feeling lingered, refusing to let her go. The wind outside rattled the windows, but it wasn't the storm that unsettled her. It was the sensation of being watched. She tried to shake off that feeling, telling herself it was just the result of a long day of travel. But the tightness in her chest only grew worse. Something was wrong. The fatigue hit her suddenly like a tidal wave. She collapsed onto the bed, but sleep didn't come easily. No matter how many times she closed her eyes, she couldn't escape the feeling of being stared at, of being surrounded. Each time she opened her eyes, the oppressive weight of dread was there, thickening the air. The hotel room, once ordinary, now felt like a trap, a place where something dark had decided to linger. As the night stretched on, Tina's sleep was plagued with strange dreams. Visions of that boy, his black eyes burning through the darkness, his face hovering just outside her door. And every time she woke up, drenched in sweat, the feeling remained, the suffocating sensation that something was outside her door, waiting. But when she looked, nothing was there. The hallway remained empty, still, yet the fear didn't leave her. The next morning, Tina woke with a terrible headache, her body completely drained of energy. The tightness in her chest had not eased. It was as though she was carrying a weight, invisible but unyielding. She stumbled to the bathroom, her mind foggy, trying to make sense of what happened. But no matter how much she tried to shake off the lingering exhaustion, the sense of unease stuck with her like a dark cloud hanging over her head. As she packed her things, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone, something, was still watching her. It was in the air, in the corners of her room, in every reflection she caught. The boy's eyes seemed to follow her, no matter where she went. By the time Tina reached her car and drove away, she thought she was free of the hotel, free of the strange boy, and the feeling of dread that gripped her all night. But as she drove down the highway, the paranoia stayed with her. Her eyes kept flicking to the rearview mirror. She couldn't help it. Each time, her heart skipped a beat. The first time it happened, she thought it was just her imagination, the product of too many sleepless hours. But the second time it was unmistakable. In the rearview mirror, she saw the boy's face, his black eyes staring back at her from the back seat of her car. Tina's blood ran cold. He was not in the car. She had locked the doors when she left, but there he was, staring at her with that unblinking, hypnotic gaze, his small face barely visible in the reflection. Her hands trembled as she gripped the steering wheel, her breath shallow, her heart pounding in her chest. She forced herself to look away to keep driving, to ignore the irrational fear, but she couldn't. The boy's eyes seemed to burn into her mind. The next few weeks were a blur of sleepless nights and constant dread. Tina couldn't shake the feeling that the boy's presence had followed her. It was like an invisible weight, an oppressive force that clung to her, refusing to let go. Every time she looked over her shoulder, every time she glanced in the rearview mirror, there he was. And every time her heart would leap into her throat. Her body felt drained. The headaches didn't cease. The exhaustion became unbearable. She couldn't focus at work, couldn't concentrate. It was as though the boy had taken something from her, a piece of her spirit, her vitality, and she was left with nothing but empty, hollow feeling that something was always just behind her, always waiting. Tina would never forget that night at the hotel, the boy with the black eyes who seemed to reach into her very soul, the feeling of being watched, even whenever no one was there. The storm outside had come and gone, but the storm inside her continued to rage. What began as a simple business trip turned into something far darker, something she couldn't explain, something that wouldn't let her go. Tina eventually left the town behind, but the paranoia, the exhaustion, the lingering sense of dread never truly left her. No matter how many mirrors she passed and no matter how many nights she lay awake, she could still see those eyes, those cold, black, soulless eyes staring back at her. And the worst part, she knew deep down that the encounter had changed her forever. There was no escaping it now, no going back. The boy had marked her, and his presence, like a curse, would linger, a shadow that would never quite fade. So, what are these black-eyed kids? Are they just a modern myth, a figment of our imagination whispered about in dark corners? Or are they something far darker, real, with the power to curse, to drain, and to destroy? These encounters leave a mark that can't easily be shaken. Whether it's the psychological trauma, the sudden wave of illness, or the paralyzing feeling of being watched, the black-eyed kids seem to follow their victims around long after the encounter ends. Some say their presence lingers, a shadow that quietly haunts the mind, never truly fading. But the question remains, what are they? Demons, spirits, interdimensional entities, or something else entirely? Whatever they are, one thing is certain: their presence remains, a creeping, chilling force that leaves you wondering, how close are they to you? Thank you for joining us here on the Mad Hatter Show. We hope that you've enjoyed diving into the eerie world of the black-eyed kids once again. If you like this video and want more stories like that to help keep you up at night, don't forget to hit the like button. Be sure to subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had an encounter with something out of the ordinary? A ghostly figure, a creepy kid, or a strange presence that you just couldn't seem to shake? Share your stories with us. We might just feature them in a future video. And if you do like our content, don't forget to subscribe. We'd love to bring you along for our next adventure. Until then, stay safe, stay aware. The black-eyed kids may be closer than you think.